Today's video examines one of the most comprehensive police corruption scandals in American history. A case where an elite anti-gang unit, designed to protect Los Angeles neighborhoods from violence, instead became a criminal enterprise operating with badges and guns. Officers who shot unarmed civilians and framed them for crimes they didn't commit. Detectives who stole cocaine from evidence rooms and sold it back on the streets. Police who planted weapons, falsified reports, and celebrated shootings like war trophies. This isn't the story of one rogue officer. This is about an entire unit that operated with impunity for years, protected by a culture that valued results over truth and arrests over justice. What makes this case particularly troubling is how many warning signs were ignored, how many complaints were dismissed, and how long it took for the truth to emerge. This is the story of the Rampart scandal, where more than 70 officers were implicated, 106 criminal convictions were overturned, and the city of Los Angeles paid out $125 million to victims whose lives were destroyed by the people sworn to protect them. Welcome to this investigation. Let's get straight into the case. The Rampart Division of the Los Angeles Police Department served a densely populated area west of downtown Los Angeles. The neighborhood was predominantly Hispanic, working class, and during the 1990s, faced significant challenges with gang activity and drug distribution. In response to these issues, the LAPD established specialized units within each division called CRASH, which stood for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. These units were given extraordinary freedom to operate. Officers wore plainclothes instead of uniforms, drove unmarked vehicles, and worked without the constraints of radio calls or routine patrol duties. They were tasked with identifying gang members, disrupting criminal activity, and taking guns and drugs off the streets. The Rampart CRASH unit was particularly aggressive. Officers developed reputations for being tough, fearless, and willing to do whatever it took to make arrests. They generated impressive statistics. Guns recovered, drugs seized, gang members arrested. On paper, the unit appeared successful. The community, however, told a different story. Complaints began arriving at the police department, filed by residents who described encounters with CRASH officers that seemed less like law enforcement and more like harassment. People reported being stopped without cause, searched without consent, and threatened when they tried to assert their rights. Some described being beaten. Others said evidence had been planted on them. The complaints were investigated, reviewed, and in nearly every case dismissed. The officer's word was accepted over the complainants, many of whom had prior criminal records or gang affiliations that made their credibility questionable in the eyes of investigators. What wasn't understood at the time was that those complaints weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And those patterns pointed to a culture within the CRASH unit that had strayed far from legitimate policing. At the center of what would become the Rampart scandal was Officer Rafael Perez. Perez joined the LAPD in 1989 after serving in the United States Marine Corps. He was transferred to the Rampart Division in 1995 and quickly became a valued member of the CRASH unit. Perez was bilingual, speaking fluent Spanish, which gave him an advantage in a division where few officers could communicate directly with residents. He developed a reputation as a productive officer who understood the streets, knew the gangs, and wasn't afraid to confront suspects. But Perez was also involved in criminal activity almost from the beginning. He would later admit that approximately 40% of the people he arrested had not committed any crime at the time of their arrest. They were simply individuals he wanted off the streets, and he manufactured the evidence needed to justify their detention. He planted drugs. He falsified reports. And he testified under oath to things he knew were false. Perez didn't operate alone. He worked closely with other CRASH officers, including Nino Durden, Brian Hewitt, and others who shared his approach to policing. The group developed their own subculture within the department, one that valued aggression, loyalty to each other, and a belief that the ends justified the means. They saw themselves as warriors in a battle against gangs, and in that battle, rules didn't always apply. The CRASH officers had a gathering place, a bar near Dodger Stadium called the Short Stop, where they would meet after particularly significant incidents. Supervisors handed out plaques containing playing cards. Red cards represented shootings where the suspects survived. Black cards represented killings. The black cards were considered more prestigious. Officers wore tattoos depicting the crash logo. A skull with a cowboy hat surrounded by playing cards showing the dead man's hand. Aces and eights. It was a culture that celebrated violence and treated serious incidents as achievements rather than tragedies. On October 12, 1996, Rafael Perez and his partner Nino Durden responded to an apartment building in the Rampart area. They encountered Javier Ovando, a young man with no criminal record and no gang affiliation. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing examples of the corruption that had taken root within the unit. According to Perez and Durden's official report, Ovando had been armed with a rifle and had pointed it at the officers, forcing them to shoot in self-defense. Ovando was struck multiple times and left paralyzed from the waist down. A rifle was recovered at the scene, photographed, and entered into evidence. The shooting was investigated and ruled justified. Ovando was charged with assault on a police officer and sentenced to 23 years in prison. He maintained his innocence, insisting he had never been armed and that the officers had shot him without provocation. No one believed him. Years later, the truth emerged. Ovando had been unarmed. The rifle found at the scene had been planted by Perez and Durden. The entire encounter, from the initial contact to the shooting to the subsequent report, had been fabricated. Perez and Durden had shot an unarmed man, left him paralyzed, and then sent him to prison for more than 2 decades based entirely on lies. And they had done it without hesitation, without remorse, and with the full support of a system that accepted their version of events without question. The Ovando case wasn't unique. It was part of a broader pattern of misconduct that included other shootings, other planted evidence, and other false reports. But for years, that pattern remained hidden. The warning signs, however, were accumulating. In March 1997, an incident occurred that would eventually lead to the scandal's exposure, though it didn't seem connected at the time. Off-duty LAPD officer Kevin Gaines was driving his green sport utility vehicle through Los Angeles when he became involved in a road rage confrontation with another driver. That driver was Frank Liga, also an LAPD officer, though neither man initially knew the other was a cop. The confrontation escalated. Gaines allegedly brandished a firearm, and Liga, believing his life was in danger, shot and killed Gaines. The shooting triggered an internal investigation, and what investigators found raised troubling questions. Gaines had connections to Death Row Records, a prominent rap label owned by Marion Suge Knight, who was himself affiliated with the Mob Piru Bloods gang. Further investigation revealed that several Rampart CRASH officers, including Gaines, David Mack, and Rafael Perez, had been working as off-duty security for Death Row Records and were being paid significant amounts of money for their services. The relationship between police officers and a record label with documented gang ties was concerning, but the full extent of the corruption wouldn't become clear for months. In November 1997, another event occurred that deepened the investigation. A Bank of America branch in Los Angeles was robbed of $722,000 in cash. The robbery was well planned and executed with precision. After a month of investigation, Assistant Bank Manager Erilyn Romero confessed to her role and identified her boyfriend, LAPD Officer David Mack, as the mastermind. Mack was arrested and eventually convicted. He was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months in federal prison. He never revealed where the money went, and while incarcerated, he reportedly told fellow inmates that he would be a millionaire by the time he was released. What made investigators particularly suspicious was what they discovered during the follow-up investigation. 2 days after the robbery, Mack had traveled to Las Vegas. He was accompanied by 2 close friends, both LAPD officers, one of whom was Rafael Perez. The trip involved significant gambling and spending. Perez denied any involvement in the bank robbery and was never charged, but the association raised questions about what else he might be involved in. By early 1998, LAPD leadership had enough concerns to establish a formal task force focused on investigating potential corruption within the Rampart Division. The task force was led by detectives assigned specifically to examine the activities of crash officers and their connections to criminal enterprises. The investigation moved slowly at first, reviewing old cases, interviewing witnesses, and looking for patterns. Then, in March 1998, investigators made a discovery that would break the case wide open. During an audit of the LAPD property room, 8 pounds of cocaine were found to be missing from an evidence locker. Within days, investigators focused on Rafael Perez as the likely suspect. Perez was a 9-year veteran of the department with access to evidence rooms and a history of cases involving cocaine seizures. On August 25, 1998, Perez was arrested at his home. According to reports, his first words to investigators were, "Is this about the bank robbery?" It wasn't. It was about the missing cocaine, which was estimated to be worth $800,000 on the street. Perez's trial began in December 1998, but it ended in a mistrial when the jury deadlocked 8-4 in favor of conviction. A retrial was scheduled for March 1999. During the time between trials, investigators continued building their case. They uncovered evidence that Perez had stolen additional cocaine beyond the initial 8 pounds. They identified connections between Perez and known drug dealers. And they received information from some of his past arrestees claiming that he and his partner had planted evidence on them. As the evidence mounted, Perez realized his situation was becoming untenable. Through his attorney, he made an offer. He would plead guilty to the theft charges and cooperate fully with investigators in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. On September 8, 1999, Perez accepted a plea bargain. He agreed to serve 5 years in prison and provide complete, truthful testimony about corruption within the Rampart CRASH unit. What followed was one of the most extensive confessions in American law enforcement history. Over the course of multiple interviews, Perez described years of criminal activity conducted by himself and other CRASH officers. He detailed how evidence was planted, how reports were falsified, and how innocent people were framed for crimes they didn't commit. He explained the Ovando shooting in full, admitting that he and Durden had shot an unarmed man, and then manufactured evidence to justify it. He implicated dozens of other officers in similar conduct. Perez described how new members of the CRASH unit were tested. They would be required to participate in planting weapons or falsifying reports to prove their loyalty and demonstrate they wouldn't report misconduct to supervisors. He explained how officers celebrated shootings at the shortstop bar, and how supervisors rewarded violence with plaques and recognition. He detailed instances where gang members were beaten during interrogations, sometimes until they vomited blood, and how those incidents were covered up with false reports. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Perez's testimony implicated more than 70 current and former LAPD officers in criminal activity or serious misconduct. The allegations ranged from planting evidence and perjury to excessive force, theft, and even murder. Not all of the implicated officers were ultimately charged or convicted. Some cases lacked sufficient corroborating evidence. Others involved misconduct that, while serious, didn't rise to the level of criminal conduct. But the pattern Perez described was clear. The Rampart CRASH unit had operated with a culture that permitted, and in some cases encouraged, illegal behavior as long as it produced arrests and maintained the appearance of aggressive enforcement. As Perez's cooperation continued, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office faced a crisis. How many convictions had been based on false testimony from Rampart officers? How many people were sitting in prison because evidence had been planted or reports had been fabricated? The district attorney established a review process to examine every case involving officers implicated by Perez. The task was enormous. Hundreds of arrests, dozens of officers, years of potentially tainted prosecutions. By the time the review was complete, prosecutors had moved to vacate 106 criminal convictions. Some of the individuals whose convictions were overturned had already served years in prison. Others were still incarcerated when their cases were dismissed. For them, the reversal meant immediate release, but it couldn't undo the time they had lost or the damage to their lives and reputations. Javier Ovando, the man who had been shot and paralyzed by Perez and Durden, was one of the first to be freed. He had served nearly 3 years of his 23-year sentence. On November 21, 2000, Ovando was awarded a $15 million settlement from the city of Los Angeles, the largest police misconduct settlement in the city's history at that time. But while Perez's cooperation was producing results in terms of overturned convictions and identifying misconduct, questions began to emerge about his credibility. Defense attorneys pointed out that Perez himself was a convicted criminal who had lied under oath for years. They argued that his testimony was unreliable and that he was exaggerating or fabricating claims to secure a lighter sentence. Some officers accused by Perez were charged and brought to trial. In those cases, juries had to decide whether to believe a confessed corrupt cop or the officers he was accusing. The results were mixed. Some defendants were convicted based on Perez's testimony, combined with corroborating evidence. Others were acquitted, with juries concluding that Perez's word alone wasn't enough. In several high-profile cases, including charges against officers Brian Liddy, Edward Ortiz, and Paul Harper, juries found the defendants not guilty. Those officers later sued the city for malicious prosecution and were awarded a $20 million settlement in 2009. The varying outcomes highlighted a central challenge in the Rampart prosecutions. Perez's testimony was essential to proving many of the allegations, but his own criminal conduct undermined his credibility in ways that made some cases impossible to win. While criminal prosecutions moved forward, the city of Los Angeles faced a wave of civil lawsuits from people whose rights had been violated by Rampart officers. The lawsuits came from individuals who had been beaten, falsely arrested, wrongfully convicted, or otherwise harmed by the misconduct Perez had described. Each case required the city to defend actions that, in many instances, could no longer be defended. The city faced more than 140 civil suits related to the Rampart scandal. Settlement costs eventually exceeded $125 million. The financial impact was significant, but the damage to the LAPD's reputation was even greater. Public trust in the department, already fragile in communities that had long complained about aggressive policing, collapsed entirely in the wake of the revelations. The scandal forced the LAPD to confront failures that went beyond individual officers. How had so many complaints been dismissed without proper investigation? Why had supervisors failed to notice patterns in arrest reports and use of force incidents that should have raised red flags? And what systemic changes were needed to prevent similar corruption in the future? In September 1999, LAPD Chief Bernard Parks convened a board of inquiry to examine the scandal and make recommendations. The board's report, released in March 2000, identified multiple contributing factors. It noted a lack of managerial oversight within the Rampart division, insufficient review of arrest reports and use of force incidents, and a failure to take complaints from community members seriously. The report made 108 recommendations for reform, including increased supervision of specialized units, mandatory polygraph testing during the hiring process, and improved systems for tracking and investigating complaints. The board's findings, however, were criticized by outside observers as insufficient. A separate analysis commissioned by the police union and conducted by Professor Erwin Kamerinsky concluded that the board of inquiry had minimized the scope of the corruption and failed to address deeper cultural problems within the LAPD. Kamerinsky's report argued that the Rampart scandal wasn't just the result of a few bad officers or inadequate supervision. It was the product of a department culture that prioritized statistics and aggressive enforcement over constitutional policing and accountability. One of the most significant consequences of the Rampart scandal was the decision to disband the CRASH units entirely. In March 2000, Chief Parks announced that CRASH would be replaced with new anti-gang details that included stricter membership requirements, greater oversight, and clearer guidelines for conduct. The move was symbolic as much as practical. An acknowledgement that the CRASH model, which had given officers extraordinary freedom with minimal accountability, had failed. The scandal also led to federal intervention. In 2001, the U.S. Department of Justice entered into a consent decree with the City of Los Angeles, requiring the LAPD to implement reforms under federal oversight. The consent decree mandated changes in how officers were trained, supervised, and disciplined. It required the department to track use of force incidents more carefully, investigate complaints more thoroughly, and create systems to identify officers with patterns of misconduct before those patterns escalated. The decree remained in effect for more than a decade, with federal monitors reviewing the department's progress and issuing regular reports on compliance. As the legal and administrative processes unfolded, attention also turned to the individual officers who had been at the center of the scandal. Rafael Perez served his 5-year sentence and was released from prison in 2006. He had cooperated extensively with investigators, provided testimony in multiple cases, and helped overturn wrongful convictions, but he remained a controversial figure. Some viewed him as a whistleblower who had exposed systemic corruption at great personal cost. Others saw him as a criminal who had lied for years and only told the truth when he had no other option. Nino Durden, Perez's partner in the Ovando shooting, was arrested in July 2000 and charged with attempted murder and conspiracy to obstruct justice. He pleaded guilty and received a 5-year sentence. During his sentencing, Durden apologized to Ovando and acknowledged the harm he had caused. Other officers faced varying consequences. Some were fired, others resigned, and a few were prosecuted and convicted. Many, however, were never charged, either because the evidence against them was insufficient or because their misconduct, while serious, fell short of criminal conduct. The unevenness of the outcomes frustrated victims and community members who felt that accountability had been incomplete. What do you think about this case and the outcomes? Do you believe justice was served, or were the consequences insufficient given the scale of the corruption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this investigation informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. The Rampart scandal remains one of the most significant police corruption cases in American history, not just because of the number of officers involved or the amount of money the city paid in settlements, but because of what it revealed about the vulnerability of law enforcement systems to abuse when oversight is weak and accountability is absent. The scandal demonstrated how a culture within a single unit could normalize criminal behavior, how complaints from community members could be systematically ignored, and how officers who committed serious crimes could continue operating for years before being stopped. It also highlighted the limitations of relying on individual officers to expose misconduct. Perez's cooperation was essential to breaking the case open, but it came only after he had been caught committing crimes himself and faced the prospect of a long prison sentence. Without that pressure, the corruption might have continued indefinitely. For the people of Los Angeles, particularly those in the Rampart area who had filed complaints and been dismissed, the scandal was both a vindication and a tragedy. They had been telling the truth all along, but it had taken years and a federal investigation for anyone to listen. The reforms that followed the scandal, mandatory federal oversight, the dissolution of CRASH, improved complaint systems, represented attempts to prevent similar failures in the future. But they couldn't undo the harm that had already been done or restore the years stolen from people who had been wrongfully convicted. The Rampart scandal continues to be studied in police academies, law schools, and criminal justice programs as a case study in what happens when the systems designed to check police power fail. It serves as a reminder that badges and uniforms don't guarantee integrity, that departments must actively work to identify and remove officers who abuse their authority, and that communities deserve to be heard when they raise concerns about the people policing them. This has been the story of the LAPD Rampart scandal, where an elite unit became a criminal enterprise, where more than 100 convictions were built on lies, and where a city was forced to reckon with the cost of looking the other way.